On to our friend Costa. Costa, are you there, my
Thanks,
friend?
John. Thank you, and thanks
Hi.
all for joining. Wonderful to be here yet again, another year. So we tend to do these doom and gloom sessions right before the party, but at least we're doing them early, right? So today I want to talk to you guys a bit about IBM's point of view on what we call data resilience, right? It's not meant to be a scare tactic. It's not meant to, um, you know, scare people, but it is meant to be a learning experience, right? So we're going to go over how IBM defines data resilience. We're going to go into some of the pitfalls that we see clients running into. And then at the end, I have a little kind of lessons learned, something that I like to call confessions of a cyber breached client. I happened to present that at IBM's Tech Exchange conference this year. So like Barry's presentation, any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But yeah, so data resilience from IBM's perspective is really a team sport, right? It's not a singular product. It's not a singular thing that that we have to go through. It's really a journey. And like any journey, there needs to be some form of foundation. And from IBM's perspective, the steps to data resilience, the first step is really understanding your data, understanding what you have, and in particular, looking at mission critical workloads, right? Because at the end of the day, our IT environments are huge and they continue to grow. So it's important to understand not only what do I have, but how important is it to the business? And from a foundational perspective, that's really important because if you don't know what you have and how important it is to the business, how do you do every other step, right? How do I protect that data? How do I ensure that it's resilient? How do I ensure that I can respond and recover in the event of some type of attack? And the good news is most of you out there already know this, right? You know this because it's part of a business continuity plan. It's part of an incident response plan that you likely already have in place. So that foundational piece is pretty easy. The second piece is secure and immutable copies. Right, so everybody has some form of data protection technology in place today, right? So you have production workloads, you take backups, likely you replicate your production workloads and replicate your backups, so you have multiple copies. What we're starting to see though from a threat perspective is once the bad guys get in, what do? They go after those backup copies, they'll go after the production copies, and they'll lock them, they'll encrypt them, they'll do something either to extort money or to do other damage. So creating some form of immutable secure copy of that data, not just a regular backup, not just off of the primary array, not just offsite. And if you think historically, a secure immutable copy, hey, IBM invented tape over 60 years ago. That's probably the most secure air-gapped copy solution known to man. And in fact, IBM's had one of our best years ever in tape, in 2024 so far. And the whole idea here is how do I prevent unauthorized access or unauthorized ability to change the data, right? And we're taking secure immutability to a whole other level. Previously, it was only reserved for backup data, right? I just mentioned tape. But we're starting to leverage secure immutable copies on primary storage devices for the purposes of two things. Threat detection, so analysis and forensic analysis and scanning, and also ultra-fast restore. If I'm hit with some type of cyber breach and I need to get back up and running fast, I probably can't afford to wait to rehydrate the data, to copy it from another site, to bring it down from the cloud. If I could just right click and mount an immutable copy for the purposes of scanning or testing, that's a lot quicker. The third piece here is the threat detection. So it's great that I've got my infrastructure is locked down. I understand what I have. I'm protecting it to the best of my abilities. But historically, we've seen security teams and infrastructure teams really siloed and not talking to each other. So what if there was a way that the infrastructure team was better at threat detection and the security team was better at responding and recovering? That mesh of the two teams allows us to mitigate how far a threat has gone. We can allow us to detect the threat a lot faster and allow us to respond and recover a lot faster. So those of you that know me, and I know quite a few of you have been doing these for a few years now, right? The average time it takes a client to respond and recover from a cyber breach is 23 days. Right? The average cost of a data breach, according to IBM's cost of a data breach study, which we do every year, is $4.8 million US. So the idea with data resilience and why we have all these steps is to do one of two things, or to do both actually. How do I shrink the time it takes to respond and recover? And therefore, how do I shrink the financial impact of that breach? Right? So if I can detect threats faster using infrastructure rather than reactive using security tools, that will help shrink that window down. Right? So from a threat detection standpoint, IBM introduced a technology called an anomaly detection on our primary storage arrays last year, where we're analyzing every single write IO that goes to the storage array. Why? Because at the end of the day, all of your data is sitting on a storage array somewhere. If we can analyze all of the writes that are coming into an array and tag them as either normal or an anomaly, that will then allow us to detect threats faster and then inform the security tools to, to take a look at the environment and say, hey, I think there might be a problem with this. So IBM is unique in this, that we are actually scanning primary storage IOs as they are being written to the array. Why? Because the faster I can detect a threat, the faster I can mitigate it, the faster I can get back up and running. That leads to the next step, which is recovery. Right, so this is historically where all the backup tools used to sit. And recovery is more than just saying, hey, I've got a copy of my data. Because the whole idea when it comes to recovery is not just I have a copy, is that copy usable, is that copy clean? So if I can take immutable snapshots on storage, if I can take immutable backups, the whole idea now from a recovery standpoint is, what if there was a way that I could just leverage those copies for the purposes of things like forensic analysis, deep malware scans, and other things like that? So I'm not just rehydrating a copy of the data, I'm ensuring that that copy is actually good and in fact clean. The last step in this is the automation and recovery testing. So it's not just, again, important to have a copy of your data, it's important to understand that copy is in fact good and clean. And then if there was a way that I could wrap around automation and orchestration, I can essentially say, hey, I've got this mission critical workload. I would like you to take an immutable copy every day and keep it for 7 days. On the 7th day, I'd like you to mount that copy, run a forensic analysis tool on it, and give me a ticky box, green or red. Is this either a good, clean copy using malware scanning tools or not? And rinse and repeat. Right? So every day I'll be scanning a different data set to ensure that I'm being proactive rather than reactive. So these are the 5 steps to data resilience. And generally where I go from here is talking to clients and saying, okay, where could some of those gaps be in an environment? Right? So the next step here is to try and understand what are the most common gaps that we see in a client environment. So if you've been part of these extravaganzas over the years, you know that IBM offers a funded, secure, and resilient assessment, which is available to everyone that's joined here today. What I've done is, over the last 4 years, we've done 450 of these assessments. We've netted down the top 5 recurring gaps that we tend to see. So what are some of these gaps? So for example, when was the last time you simulated a ransomware attack and tried to do an instant mass restore, right? Everybody does the once a year DR test, right, for about 10, 20% of their environment. Everybody goes high fives and goes out for a beer after and says this was successful. But when was the last time you really tried to simulate a full scale cyber attack, right, where you had to restore hundreds of terabytes, if not petabytes of data? Do you think you could do it? How long do you think it would take? The next thing is this concept of immutability. If you haven't implemented immutability on your backups, that's probably something that's fairly straightforward and easy to do. If you haven't implemented immutability on your primary storage using immutable snapshots, that's also probably something that's fairly easy to do. And the concept, again, around immutability is all about locking down that copy to ensure that no one can delete it, no one can alter it, no one can encrypt it. Right? And then when it comes to doing a restore, have an isolated environment that you can restore to, rather than necessarily restoring back into a production environment where you may be reinfecting the environment there. And lastly, implement and manage an incident response plan. Now, you may already have a business continuity plan that essentially says, hey, if site A goes down, I fail over to site B, and these are the steps that I need to do so. But keep in mind that an incident response plan is different than a disaster recovery plan, and primarily for one reason. The key tenet to looking at disaster recovery plans is the assumption that the copy of the data I have at the secondary site is actually good and clean. Right? Because I'm protecting myself from a disaster, not necessarily a cyber attack. So an incident response plan is really different than a disaster recovery plan. So I'm the one that's keeping everyone from Chef Michael Smith. So I'm just going to finish off here by going through what we call the confessions of a cyber breached customer. Right? So these are real live customer situations that I personally have been involved with in 2024. I presented this in at our Tech Exchange conference. The first lesson learned, I just mentioned it, documentation. So incident response plans. I unfortunately ran into a situation where a client had a breach. Their incident response plan was on a file share that was encrypted. So guys, lesson learned, you have to physically print this off. Physically print a copy of the incident response plan, because you don't know if your network access is going to be cut off. You don't know if that file is going to be encrypted, or hey, maybe even altered to the point where you're actually causing harm rather than solving things. Yes, it's a pain to print it off. And yes, by the time you print it, something has changed because our environments are constantly changing. But have a physical copy of an incident response plan, know who to go to, certain order of operations and things that need to be done. Swing space is an important one. I had no clue, but I had a customer this year where the RCMP got involved in their cyber breach and said, everybody hold up. We're confiscating a copy of your data. You cannot just restore over the infected data. You need to keep a copy of it for our forensic analysis teams. The cyber insurer did the same thing. So have some swing space. Now, this one's tough, right? Because no one has the money and the time and space to be able to say, I'm just going to have, a petabyte or 100 terabytes of data sitting around. But know that in the event of some type of cyber breach, someone might be coming knocking and saying, we need to have potentially access to a copy of that infected data, whether it's for law enforcement or insurance purposes. Right? I mentioned this isolated recovery environment needs somewhere to scan copies. You need somewhere to mount copies to be able to run analysis on them before you just blindly restore. Right? I had a client this year that had an incident happen. They didn't have a recovery environment. Unfortunately, we wasted 5 days building one. Right after the fact, because they knew you can't just restore back over to production. So have some form, and it could be older gear that's sitting around off maintenance or whatever it is. You need to have an isolated network, isolated recovery environment for the purposes of getting back up and running. Things like Active Directory, DNS, domain controllers, they should be ready and available to get back up and running quickly in that isolated environment. And lastly, guys, I talk fast, but employee burnout is a thing. When clients run into situations where they have a breach, people get tired. People make mistakes when they get tired, right? So invest in some form of help, whether it's a business partner like i-Virtualize, whether it's an incident response retainer with a cyber insurer company. Ensure that you have help and someone available to help out, because employees cannot work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Something will happen. And that all ties back to the documentation, because if you don't have the proper documentation, you can have all the help in the world, but if they don't know what they need to do, it becomes difficult. So I'm going to finish this off here with just understanding that data resiliency does require an architectural approach. So understand what you have, its importance to the business, design for recovery. So ensuring that you have a recovery time objective, recovery point objective specific to cyber. Automate where practical, where you can, and please practice, practice, practice. An untested plan is not a plan. And with that, thank you again. And thanks again, John, for having IBM here.